What's the link between software and your health? Hi, my name is Oded, and in this podcast I'll talk about software development in the field of medical device, pharmaceutical, and healthcare with industry leading experts. Today we have Shawnnah Monterrey to give us advice on effective project management. Shawnnah, thank you so much for participating in the podcast. And before we dive into your advice about project management for software in medical device, can you please tell us a bit about yourself?
Sure. Hi, Adid. Thanks for having me. I'm Shawnnah Monterrey, CEO of BeanStock Ventures. I have 20 plus years experience in medical device and leadership roles such as Carl Zeiss Meditech, Covidien, and Illumina.
Okay, so let's just dive in and start asking, maybe from a system engineer perspective, what would be your advice to ensure the viability of the project and the product that we are planning?
As a medical software development company, we see program management and systems engineering as being essential to any client engagement and any product development effort. First, you want to start by understanding the end user. A given product can have multiple, including clinicians and the patient. You want to look at the current market space by looking at parallel industries within the medical device space. A lot of companies have maybe done something similar. You also want to look at gaps within the competition. Customer complaints are very telling, even looking at the FDA mod database and even surveying their existing customers. From there, it's important to then define what we call a minimal viable product. And I'm not referring to like the lean startup MVP, where it's just getting a product out there, even if it's of low quality and low fidelity, right? That would be catastrophic in the medical device industry. But you really want to be able to manage throughout the development life cycle the expectations you have from the other team members, right? So during the course of product development, you may get pushed by the marketplace and by sales and marketing themselves. And as you understand more about the needs of the customer, you'll start to realize that not all features that you thought were important at the beginning of the development will be important when you go to launch.
But how do you do that? How do you take that mindset of putting the product in the hands of the customer and doing it with a medical device that has to go through so many loops before you can really officially let someone use it in a treatment?
Yeah, I mean, it's really about integrating the customer throughout the product development lifecycle. I mean, starting up front, as I mentioned, like really getting into their headspace, sending them surveys, asking them what's important, demoing some aspects of the product to them, like low fidelity wireframes and ultimately high fidelity wireframes, having them interact with it in an actual simulated, setting, and to provide feedback on the utility of the product. A lot of times you'll get requirements that are very vague from the customer, like, okay, it needs to be fast. Okay, what does that actually mean? Well, the important piece is to put a stake in the ground and validate that with the customer to say, is this responsive enough? Is this meeting your needs, right? Because our interpretation of what the client and customer is asking for could be very different. And if you're not integrating that through the software development life cycle, and you build a product that's a miss, it could be very expensive at the end of the day.
So maybe, is it fair to say that, like, when we think about Agile and the definition of done, then you kind of advising that at the end of the sprint, it's not that we just show it to the product manager, look, this is what we developed, this was the requirement. It's like, no, we kind of find ourselves a customer, a representative customer, and put it in his hand and really see his reaction, just to say, okay, we've nailed this.
Correct. And it doesn't have to be at every sprint. It can be at defined milestones. It can be done for every iteration. Like with scaled Agile, it's more of looking at the iterations and the milestones at hand. So maybe you do it every month or every 3 months, right? But there's a big risk of putting it off towards the end and finding out that the product you develop doesn't meet the needs of the end user. It's very unlikely, especially for large organizations, that they would actually then delay the launch, right? It's almost like, okay, well, that's great, but we need to get revenue now. And we've already told our shareholders and our stakeholders that the product's going to launch. We're going to go ahead and move ahead with launching it. And then everyone's curious why, it was a miss in the marketplace.
Right. So you're putting a lot of focus on the customer, a bit more than on the product. Like not to have a successful project with a product that is less useful, and then making sure that the product is right for the customer.
Exactly. I would say it's the most important piece. It would be understanding the customer, because ultimately they're the one that will define the success. But one should be careful not to ignore the product. Right, an excellent product that has reliability issues is still a failed product. So it's important to understand the needs of the customer, and then understand that safety and reliability and quality are also huge factors contributing to the success of your product. And it enables you to scale beyond the early adopters, right? Early adopters are more accepting of like changes within the product. But as you start scaling, it's really important to have a reliable and high quality product, especially in the medical device space. It's expected.
Right. When you see a software team at the beginning of a project, and you ask to give advice, or how do you measure their capabilities? How do you identify gaps?
We have a process, and we call it the BSV Way, the BeanStock Ventures. The acronym is BSV. And as part of our process, we always start with what we call the assessment phase. This allows us to understand the goals and objectives of the problem space. So once we understand that, then we head towards creating what we call the strategy phase, which involves defining the approach towards a solution, followed by the creation of the team. The team is always tailored and then targeting the problem at hand. So ideally, the development team should be structured for the product development, but until the problem and solution space is well understood, it's difficult to determine if the team has the right skill sets. So we believe it's essential to have experts on the team that actually understand the technological domain, but also the industry domain, right? So if you're building, let's say, next generation sequencing product, you want to make sure that you have experts in the space that understand sequencing, as well as the technology behind the sequencing solution. All teams will have gaps, but if the gaps are identified, let's say every iteration, you mentioned sprints within Agile, you can define a strategy and identify those gaps early on and define a strategy to bridge those gaps. Some strategies include having guest speakers that have, industry knowledge around a certain particular topic, training, bridging those gaps, training, sometimes bringing in an expert consultant for a specific task. We have a client particularly that has a gap in the area of cybersecurity. So we're bringing in a cybersecurity expert to help us bridge that gap, do a proper assessment, and then leverage that knowledge back into the product development team.
But as software developer, we are kind of trained to be agnostic to the domain of the like if it's finance or medical device, but it doesn't really works, right? It's like you said, you need in the team that domain expertise. It's not really the silos. Oh, we're doing software. Another team is doing the requirement. It doesn't really work successfully. Is that part of the point that you were saying?
Yeah, I agree. So I think, the product owner may have an understanding of how the system's intended to work, but the team needs to be able to absorb that, right? So even if they're writing something so generic as like a logger, right, they still need to understand the end use of that. Right? Who's going to be using the logger? What information is important for this specific feature, right? Because not every feature is the same. So being agnostic from a programming perspective is great, right? Because you can be nimble. You can decide, okay, I'm going to develop, Java versus C# because that tech stack makes more sense for this actual application. But at the end of the day, you're still building a very specific solution for a very specific problem.
Are you seeing a shift in the way that medical device companies are are making software, kind of moving from the more embedded world to a more even IoT or even web solutions. And how does that, if you see that trend, how does it impact, and what does medical device manufacturer need to keep in mind when they are experience this transition in the solution they are providing for the customers?
Yeah, as you say, the old way of thinking is that the system and operating system needs to be locked down, right? You need to be able to control your environment to maintain that aspect of safety, reliability, and reproducibility. I still see that approach being applied to modern ways of conducting software development, even with the use of Agile tools. So right now, this old thinking is a big cause of frustration for many modern software engineers that are being asked to take their existing automated, very dynamic framework and then try to fit it into this old paradigm, which oftentimes is very controlled, very static, waterfall, even paper-based. So for us, when we saw this gap, we launched what we call SOAR. It's a software online regulatory training, which has the intent of educating regulatory quality software engineers on how to be agile while still maintaining compliance and producing safe and effective products. So we believe our stance has been for customers that have a tendency to want to lock everything down, that it's not realistic to remain competitive. So instead, we believe that understanding your dependencies and understand the dependencies and where the system can change and the risk that will pose to your device is preferred. And it can be mitigated within the product design itself, right? Outside of taking the extreme measure of just locking down a system because the team doesn't want to take the time to really understand how it's reliant on some of the subsystems that like something like an operating system provides.
Right, and I don't know, how do you lock Azure or AWS? I don't even think that's possible. I think they are updating all the time.
Yeah, not only that is it not possible, but it also is an important part of the ecosystem, right? Like creating a whole cloud distributed system is very expensive to have something under that tight control. And I think that, the regulators expect these systems to change because they need to change in order to address, the cybersecurity risks, right? I mean, how do you actually prevent cybersecurity from happening like an intrusion if you're not actively updating the system for patches? And I think that's the world that we live in now, is that it's very open. It allows a lot of innovation. It allows us to develop better products actually faster without reinventing the wheel. But at the same time, there's still a lot of uneasiness around that approach. And again, it goes back to really understand, okay, well, if my platform's running on AWS, what are my dependencies and what checks do I put in place within my design to ensure if these dependencies change, I can still operate, right? And I can still be safe and I can still have an effective product, right? It's not going to degrade the quality of my system because you actually understand those dependencies. So it's more going from trying to control those dependencies to just understanding them and then building it in your product to make sure that if those change, then you're still able to operate.
Right, and basically you are reducing risk because it's like writing yourself the operating system or using an operating system that is used by millions of people. It's more likely that if you use an operating system that is widely used, it will be less prone to bugs than if you write the operating system and have absolutely full control. And
exactly, I saw this when I was working at another company where they had an embedded system and they decided to control every aspect of the product, and they even built like a USB driver. And the engineer that was designing the USB driver had no knowledge of USB itself, so it was very bug prone, and it was actually a key attribute of the product. So it was actually riskier to do that than it was to actually get an existing driver off the shelf and validate that. Yeah, you're exactly right.
But when you come to those traditional companies and you see the quality management system and the change control procedures, how do you help them with the transition to change to the mindset that you just described? That yes, calculate the risk, but but still at the same time maintain agility?
I've been the most effective by showing them the risk process itself, right? And so we have a particular client that wants to validate all of their tools, right? Like literally create like intended use requirements, test protocols, execute the validation. And what we're seeing is that their design history file and the effort they put to validate the tools is even more rigor than they put into the medical device itself, right? Which makes no sense. It's so much backwards. And so what we try to do is approach everything from a risk perspective, and we show them, okay, look, here's the risk like associated with the actual tool, how it's being used. Right from there, okay, if something goes wrong, will it get caught? What will it be, right? What can it be? And will it get caught downstream? And then how catastrophic would it be, right? And really looking at that risk-based approach and including even probabilities, right? To say, okay, well, this is not very likely to happen, or there's checks kind of down the line. And it takes less time to do that than to actually just invest in doing the validation yourself. To your point, it takes less time to validate an operating system than to build it yourself. And it's actually less risky. So I think if you can kind of show that methodology, it's instrumental in getting buy-in.
But that's really a real pain point. I mean, and the point that you advised just to think about the risk is vital, because I know so many organizations they want to upgrade the CI/CD, right? No, we don't do that because we have to do validation, and it's like the risk is to the safety is almost not existing. So the validation could have been so lean or so minimal, and still this in reality stops the organization from improving. It's like the bureaucracy sometimes is really hindering the continuous quality improvement.
Yeah, continuous quality improvement of the product and stifling innovation. I don't know how many companies I've been at where they are reluctant to build a new feature because inherently, it's risky, without even trying to get FDA approval, right? Without even trying to develop it. And then instead, what will end up happening is that an organization will acquire a startup that then has done that. Right. And then what ends up happening is, now we bought the startup, we need to build it back into our quality system. And hence now it's stifling the startup, which was the intent to innovate in the first place. And you're right. It's just becoming very bureaucratic. And you see it more in larger organizations. But that's not to say that model isn't being taken from, let's say, VPs of quality and managers of QA going into the startups and just taking what they know and applying it. It actually needs to be just kind of derooted and looked at from a different perspective. So if you look at the software development teams, they're already doing good things, right? They're already focused on best practices. They're doing good work. They're doing high quality work. You have to look at it from that lens and then build it back, as opposed to taking this very static, very waterfall thing and then applying it and forcing it into a team. Because what that's creating is bogging down the team. It's not taking advantage of their automated systems that they have in place, and it's actually not benefiting from the good work that they're already doing. It actually bogs them down and slows them down. And so I feel like the best approach is to look at what the team is doing currently and how to tweak it or leverage it as much as possible to then comply with some of the nuances in the regulation, right? Just the specific aspects. And even then, if the regulation says A, their guidance documents, what the FDA has is guidance documents, right? So the guidance document says A. Sometimes conducting A isn't necessary for your product. It doesn't even make sense. So then you just, again, take a risk-based approach and justify to the FDA, well, we're not doing these things because of this, and it's being mitigated because of that. Or there's no need to do this because our technology doesn't rely on these things, right? And here's why. Because they are very reasonable. And I think a lot of times we just don't even want to have that discussion or that negotiation. And I think that's important. I think having that discussion and that risk-based approach is really key to building a product effectively and within the constraints of the organization and the market demands and all of that.
Yeah, I mean, you're touching the point. I just want to share with you two examples and maybe hear your thought. One of them is, I had unit tests, right? And I ran it with Microsoft MS Tester. And the unit test report, it just shows pass or fail. It doesn't show, only when it's fail, it shows what was the expected and the actual. But when it passed, it just write pass. Now, I send this report and say, no, we have to show for every unit test that this was what was the expected and what was the actual. And that I had to really dig into the format of the reporting for Microsoft, just to find a way that I can show the expected, and they wanted to see the steps. I mean, there's no really steps here, but I had to do so many jumping so many loops that really contributed zero to the quality, just to make a report that looks more like the way that they think that an auditor would want to see the report.
Exactly. And I think there needs to be a shift with the auditors, right? So when the FDA is now shifting their mindset, right, in terms of being more progressive and more agile, which you're seeing, it doesn't necessarily trickle down then to the auditors that come in that we're used to seeing, right? And so the auditors are very evidence-based, and now we're more tool-driven. And there's always been a reluctancy for organizations to open up the tools, right? I might get, cited for something because one of the developers, put some leading comment in there that makes me think like they didn't close out this issue and now we're exposed, right? And that's the whole reason why, organizations like these reports, because they can see it and they can constrain it. But what if we opened it up and we just opened up our tools and said, look, this is how we do things. This is how we track bugs. This is how it's traced to here, right? I think there'll be more meaningful conversations if we started moving more towards showing the actual true evidence as it's being done live in real time, right? And actually observing the process. And so the FDA has something that's interesting, and I believe they started piloting it. It's the pre-certification program. And what it does is for lower risk products, though, understandably, but they believe that if you have a consistent process and you're able to show consistency with the process, then you're able to build consistent products, right? So now they would be moving more towards looking at your process for repeatability, knowing that would then lead to high quality and consistent products, because they know that if there was a bug out in the field, it would get handled a certain way, right? If there was an issue that wasn't anticipated, they know bugs are going to go through, right? That they can trust that the company is going to handle it, responsibly and effectively. And so that's interesting to see. I'm really excited about that.
That sounds amazing. I mean, it's just like you say, it's really the process, because why do I need to make a report of unit tests when it's gated? Every time I check in, I must, for the bill to go in, I must go through the unit tests. So it's really about the processes. It's more, why do we need some paper just so that, in this version, in this release, we made it, we make it always.
Exactly. And it's part of the code review, and we have code review guidelines to check that that you have, you're looking at it from a design and hazard perspective. And with the unit test, we have tools to show the coverage, right? We have coverage tools to show, okay, well, we have a high % coverage, so we are testing every path. So to your point, why do we need test steps, which doesn't even make sense for unit tests, right? And let alone acceptance criteria, if the acceptance criteria at that point is so loosely tied to a requirement, right? Once you're down to testing a unit test for a math library, right, that adds 2 numbers or whatever, I'm being really, generic here, but that's the intent. Once you get down to that level of unit testing, it's so far removed from the actual requirement that you're implementing.
Yeah. The traceability at that level makes no sense. It's just requirement to system level testing. That's the only really traceability that makes sense.
Oh yeah, and then traceability can become very onerous and expensive, right? I think if you're able to define your system, like your architecture, and then decompose from there, then from every subsystem within your software system, you can show traceability then to your design, which then traces to your code, and inherently, not through a special trace matrix or anything, just inherently, right? And then from there, the nature of just having unit tests tied to every component, every class, right? Whatever level you break down your system to, whatever granularity, it's inherent, right? It's already inherently traced.
Right. Right. Oh, okay. And how does human factor goes together with what you said before about the customer?
Yeah, so human factors engineering to me is the understanding of the end user's intuitive use of a given product. So it's more than just training a user on the appropriate use of a product. It's actually building a product that the customer can easily use with minimal training while reducing the risk of a misuse. So to do this right, it's important to understand the needs of the user and then to take those needs and implement them into the design and validate the product with representative users to ensure that the needs are being met. And so you talked about doing it at every sprint. I was suggesting doing it at every, iteration, at key milestones, even doing it early on with concepts, because it's very inexpensive to change concepts. Well, it's much more expensive when you get user feedback at the end to then change your design, right? Because people are already used to it. There's labeling already written against it. Like it's just more tightly coupled into the rest of the quality system. It becomes very costly to change the design at the very end.
And do you have any advice about the regulatory phase? I mean, sometimes it's like we have UDD 510K, some letters to file. I mean, can you maybe advise a bit about how this phase, how to avoid the common mistakes?
Yeah, sure. So as you know, 510K is one way to get regulatory approval for your device. So this approach assumes that there's a predicate. So to avoid delays due to regulatory requirements, it's important to first to understand the intended use of your product early on. So intended use includes understanding the users, as I mentioned before, the environment, the demographics of your users, even the technology, and ultimately the clinical utility of your product. Once you define the intended use, then you can use this to determine your regulatory strategy and even your safety classification. So the safety classification determines what level of rigor you need to be able to produce evidence as part of your part of your submission. And so by the time a team has passed the feasibility phase, they should clearly have defined and communicated regulatory strategy. You'll be surprised with many of our clients that we worked in many organizations, we're moving towards a launch and we're moving towards like a very defined product and release, and the regulatory strategy is still not defined. And it's really important to understand the positioning from that perspective. Like, okay, who's going to use the product? It actually matters, right? It changes how I'm going to develop the product. And so many engineering teams, as we mentioned, they're following like, modern and best practice software development methodologies. They're already aligned with FDA guidance, right? And other industry standards. So FDA guidance and industry standards came from best practice. So I believe the team to comply is just a matter of understanding the nuances of the regulation and ensuring they're integrated in the existing software development processes. We are an FDA accredited third-party review organization, and we find that many of our potential customers have very unrealistic expectations of the regulatory process, and they have critical time to market milestones that end up being delayed because they didn't define their regulatory strategy up front. So we think it's very important to have that up front. Doesn't mean it can't change, but it's really important to have it defined and have it well communicated across the team so the team can actually understand how it applies to them.
Excellent. As we come to an end, I want to ask you a bit personal question. The engineering field is a very masculine dominated sector. I want to ask you, why do you think is that is, and how can we get more qualified women in technical and leading positions?
Yeah, I've been asking that myself. Right? So from the 80s, we've seen significant decrease in female computer science graduates. I think it went from 37%. Now we're seeing less than 20%. I even remember my undergrad, I felt like it was like 8%. I would be one of many in a class of, 100 students, one female. So some believe that this is due to the gaming industry. I'm not sure if you heard this theory. The gaming industry was becoming popular in the 80s, and it resonated more with men, with young men than women. And so at that point, we started to see a shift of women exiting computer science. But what's interesting is that you see an uptick of women in in like political science, law, legal, medical, like you're seeing an actual increase, and computer science has still been declining. And so I believe to get more women into technical positions, I think first it starts with advocating to women at a young age just to increase visibility. I think at this point, it may not even be apparent that this is actually a potential career path and where that career path can take you. For women existing in the field today, we just need to believe in them. We need to give them opportunities to serve in leading positions. Our hiring strategies need to change. This was very eye-opening for us at BeanStock. So at BeanStock Ventures, we get a significant number of female applicants. And this is so different compared to other medical device companies that I previously worked for. I was always in a recruiting role. And I was lucky if I even got one. We get a significant number of female applicants. So I started asking why. And so as we started asking why, like, why is this the case? We became to understand that at the job description level, the way it's written can either attract or deter female candidates from applying. We found that the more technical, the less interested female candidates were, right? They want to understand the meaning behind the job. What's the big vision? Where's this going to take me, right? They needed to be passionate about the role because the technical pieces was just part of the qualifications. Yes, I, of course, should have these skills, right? They weren't so focused on that. Another aspect of recruiting is widening the net and ensuring that when you bring in candidates to interview, that they're equally represented, right? So an equal number of male and female allows you to widen the net, and that might take a little bit longer in recruiting. For companies seeking to increase their female representation, I think it's important to start with leadership. Having a diverse leadership team is definitely a positive indicator for women at the junior level. We found that me being woman CEO and having a balanced leadership team makes a really positive impact. And there's not a lot of mentors in this space, and we're here to change that. So we're at BeanStock right now. I'm proud to say that we're at being a technical software development engineering company. We're at 44% female representation.
Wonderful. That is wonderful, and I'm sure that will be very inspiring to anyone listening. Just to finish, maybe you can tell how can people follow your publication. You described the training that you offer.
Oh, sure. So we have the training material is published at our website, www.beanstockventures.com. And you can follow us on LinkedIn. We're pretty active. So we post newsletters. At least we try once a week to have a posting, something regulatory related. And we just started to blog about modern software development in the medical device industry that I think everyone will find interesting.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Adid.